Good evening, and welcome to the Museum at MFIT Fashion Culture series. Tonight, it is our pleasure and our honor to have our very own director and chief curator, Valerie Steele, present her book, Paris Fashion, which is a very important book in the history of fashion, and this is a new edition. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerie Steele.
Thank you so much. Paris Fashion has always been one of my favorite books. It was my second book that I wrote, and it came out first in 1988, and then a second edition slightly updated in 1998. And then a few years ago, my publisher asked if I'd like to do a new version with 3 times as many pictures, all in color. And although I can't imagine wanting to redo any of my other books, this one I loved working on so much. If nothing else, it's been a fabulous excuse to keep going back to Paris and doing research. So I said yes. However, it ended up taking me longer than I thought because I didn't want to just add to the last chapter and do a new intro. I went through the entire book and basically rewrote about a third of it, adding some of the new information that's been found over the years. But when the book came out, reviewers were very surprised because it wasn't a history of haute couture, and it wasn't just a standard history of fashion, which goes, there was Worth, and then there was Poiret, and then there was Chanel, and then there was Dior, and then there was Saint Laurent. This wasn't what I thought was the most important thing about Paris fashion. Of course, the designers were important, but it seemed to me that what made Paris for 300 years and counting the capital of fashion was really because of the depth and sophistication of the fashion culture in Paris, which involved knowledgeable and sophisticated fashion performers and spectators, who included artists, writers, flaneurs, actresses, milliners, a whole host of people who collectively made Paris really the center of fashion. So this was what the book was about and what I continued to focus on. Of course, the designers are important too, but as you'll see, what made it special was the culture. Now, you have to go back to a time before Paris was the capital of fashion. And for a long time, there were many little fashion centers. There was wonderful fashion very early on in cities like Florence in Italy, or at courts like the court of Burgundy. The dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century were much richer and more powerful than the kings of France. Or even in the 10th century, the court of Heian Kyo in Japan, or in Ming Dynasty China, the city of Suzhou. These were all major fashion cities. With the rise of the nation state, Spain became the first sort of large national fashion center, and Spanish black, partly derived from the court at Burgundy, swept all over Europe in Protestant as well as Catholic countries. In the 17th century, though, with the appearance on the scene of Louis XIV, France became the most powerful and wealthy continental state, and French fashion became the leading type of fashion. In part, this was a question of deliberate government policy. The Minister of the Economy, in effect, Colbert, said, "Fashion will be to France what the gold mines of Peru are to Spain." In other words, this was going to be the source of France's wealth. And foreigners were absolutely astonished at how the French were obsessed with fashion. It seemed that every day they were coming up with new fashions. And in particular, fashion seemed to be emerging from the court. So here you see a 17th century image of a courtier. And this was the kind of fashion that 17th century French dictionaries would describe the word mode, fashion, and say, it's the style of clothing followed at the court. And then the encyclopedia would go on and say, the French produce the most and newest fashions, and they're followed by people all over the world, except in Spain. The Spanish never changed their fashions. And foreigners in other countries agreed as well. They were astonished at constant novelties that emerged in Paris. This was already, I think you could say, that Paris was the capital of Western fashion by the last quarter of the 17th century. And this became even more true in the 18th century, when a style of very elaborate, aristocratic dress became fashionable, but it was no longer so codified as it had been at the court. Instead, it was a question of individual aristocrats or wealthy bourgeois who developed a culture of novelty. Here you see, of course, Francois Boucher's painting of Madame de Pompadour, who was the official mistress of Louis XV and a great leader of fashion and the arts. But equally important was the rise of a real fashion industry based in Paris. And this involved all kinds of artisans, whether they were embroiderers, feather makers, couturiers, which just meant people who sewed, or modistes. And here you see a little modiste, which is someone who went around selling the trimmings that went on dresses or on hairstyles or hats. It didn't yet mean milliner, the way hat maker, the way it does now. And because the dresses stayed with the same silhouette for a relatively long period and were very expensive to produce, the way you made them new was by adding new trimmings. The most famous of these modistes would be Rose Bertin, who was known as the Minister of Fashion for Marie Antoinette. And she, of course, didn't go around kneeling on her customers' floors like this little gal. Instead, except for Marie Antoinette, whom she visited at the palace, all of her customers came to her. And she was apparently already very bossy and very proud and always boasting about the new styles that she developed for the queen. Another aristocrat said you sometimes had to kind of slap her down or her insolence would get too great because she was already so full of herself as a leader of fashion. The fashion media also were developing. And although there were some early attempts at doing fashion magazines, and of course, as you saw before, fashion prints, for a long time, the most popular method of disseminating new Paris fashions was through these little fashion dolls, the famous Poupées de la Rue Saint-Honoré. And here you see a dress for one of these fashion dolls. They were sent out approximately once a month from the little boutiques on the Rue Saint-Honoré, and they went all around Europe, England, the Ottoman Empire, the New World, and this was the way you got information. Some of them were doll-sized, but actually a couple of years ago in Paris, I saw a life-sized fashion doll, which was extraordinary in a private collection wearing a court gown. Then you did have also, of course, the fashion press, which developed. And I bought these two prints early on in my collecting career. And the first one over there is a French one from about 1800. And you can see the woman's décolletage is so low that her nipples are actually showing. Several months later, in February 1801, the British made this copy where her décolletage has been pulled up. And to compensate for that, there's a little table with bare-breasted caryatids below. So when I bought this, the French dealer sneered, "La pudeur anglaise," English prudery. Americans also copied copied Paris fashions. And in the book, you'll see some examples of copies from Godey's Ladies' Book, which are taken from originals from La Mode Illustrée. But the Americans were very ambivalent about copying things from Paris. There are constant complaints about licentious Paris and infidel France, where a woman stoops from her high position of modesty and virtue and descends down into the sort of vulgar crowd. And they complained that how could the daughters of Puritan ancestors wear clothes created by the courtesan class in the wicked city of Paris? So this ambivalence existed there. Paris was the desirable source of all new fashions. On the other hand, there was something that seemed at the very least, undemocratic or immoral or excessive or Catholic about all these fashions. Now, in the 18th century, Paris was also still the capital of men's fashion, and it was just as luxurious and decorative as women's fashion. There was nothing effeminate about a man wearing a pink silk or velvet suit with fine lace and embroidery of flowers. That simply signified that it was aristocratic. However, already in England, by the 1860s, a new style of dress was emerging, not just among the urban bourgeoisie, but also among English aristocrats. So here you see this wonderful painting of Sir Brooke Boothby, who is a natural man lying in his beautifully tailored sort of grayish brown wool suit, lying on the ground, holding a copy of Rousseau, so you can see that he's a natural man, but he's also happens to be the eldest son of a baronet. And so this new type of fashion for upper-class men began to appear in England by the 1760s and also spread to France. Many French aristocrats quickly became Anglophiles when it came to this sort of clothing, and they too started wearing English-style dress. So sometimes French writers would remonstrate and say, go back to your silks and your embroideries. Carry your hat under your arm and not on your head. Remember to do it the way it's done in Paris. But this was the trend of the future. And already by the end of the 18th century, London had become effectively the capital of men's fashion. But Paris remained the capital of women's fashion. Even before the revolution, new styles were emerging that were less formal than the kind of elaborate dresses worn over panniers and stays that you saw in the portrait of, say, Madame de Pompadour. Here you see already in 1783 a painting by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun of Marie Antoinette wearing what was known as a chemise dress. So very lightweight, high-waisted, deliberately naive and neoclassical. This was part of a wave of neoclassicism that swept through all the arts in Paris. Unfortunately, this painting was very badly received when it was shown in public. People said the Queen was showing herself virtually in her underwear, and it was quickly taken down and replaced by another portrait of the Queen wearing a formal court gown with hoops and a tight stays and showing her with two of her children. Liberty of dress was officially proclaimed during the French Revolution. And although Daniel Roche is correct in saying that the revolution did not revolutionize fashion, nevertheless, dress was a very significant element in political discourse, and a few components of revolutionary dress did permanently transform fashion. Here you see Count Mirabeau in 1791 giving a speech in front of the National Assembly. And he's wearing the clothing, the official clothing of the Third Estate. The First Estate, not the aristocracy, not the ecclesiastical officials, but everybody else, the 99% of the population. And it's a dark wool suit. And although he's an aristocrat, he's wearing that to proclaim there shouldn't be these divisions between the parts of society, that everyone should be a citizen. And so this was clearly seen as a kind of highly political statement. And indeed, this would be the future of menswear, this kind of dark wool suit. Meanwhile, the working class were wearing somewhat different clothes. And here you see, this is a portrait of an actor, the actor Chenard, playing the role of a sans-culotte, that is, a working class man. Now, the term sans-culotte means without knee breeches. And unlike aristocratic and bourgeois men who still wore knee breeches and silk stockings, some working class men wore trousers. And so you see him here wearing trousers, wooden sabot. He's not wearing a red Liberty cap because that had already fallen out of favor with the revolutionary government. That was too radical. Instead, he's wearing a cockade, a blue, white, and red revolutionary nationalist cockade on his hat. So this was the look of the more radical working class group in the revolutionary period. And it was at this point that the government passed a law in which they proclaimed that no person of one or the other sex can constrain any citizen or wife of a citizen from dressing in any particular manner, each being free to wear the clothing appropriate to their sex. And if you tried to prevent them from doing that or force them to wear something else, you would be under pain of being considered and treated as a suspect. That is a counter-revolutionary, and that was a very bad thing that could get you sent to jail or even to the guillotine. And that law was actually passed because some radical sans-culotte women were trying to force other women to, wear cockades and so on. And the government was very much against women getting involved in politics. And so they were saying, no, you can't force people to wear anything they don't want. And so this, again, indicates that, as Lynn Hunt puts it, questions of dress lay at the heart of the French Revolution in both its democratic and its totalitarian aspects. In terms of fashion history, Paris really became known, among other things, as the capital of revolution. And there were, of course, repeated revolutions after the Great Revolution of 1789. And this, in a way, has translated also into revolutions in avant-garde art and avant-garde fashion. Here you see two pictures. On the far side, after the radical Jacobin phase of the revolution ended, there was a period when some rather wild styles would emerge with the incroyable, the man in his somewhat English style but exaggerated clothing, and the woman, the merveilleuse or marvelous one, in her more radical version of this neoclassical dress. And then here, closer to me, is, of course, Delacroix's famous Liberty Leading the People, which was painted in 1830, the year of the 1830 Revolution. I won't walk you through this, also the 1848 Revolution, the 1870 Commune, etc. But Paris was a city which was prone to explode and became really sort of the center for all revolutionaries. Now, same year, 1830, we see this beautiful fashion illustration by Javarny from La Mode. And this was the period in which Balzac was writing for the same magazine, saying, "The toilette is the expression of society." And in the book, I talk a lot about how Javarny's images of different types and Balzac's novels are filled with different types of people, and their clothes are always a very important component into telling you who they are. Balzac believed fervently that dressing the way you wanted to become was the best way to become that in the future. So he really talked a lot, and people at the time consistently believed that you could dress in a way that would help you rise in society. So there's a lot of imitation, a lot of competition. This is when you start seeing more and more books explaining the etiquette and fashion, because more and more people are dressing in more or less fashionable styles. In addition to a novelist like Balzac, you had poets such as Charles Baudelaire who were very interested in the issue of fashion. He was personally a dandy who wore almost all black, and this again became very much a feature of menswear over the course of the 19th century. So sometimes called the Great Masculine Renunciation, where they gave up all of the color and decoration in favor of dark and sober-looking clothes. But of course, for a true dandy like Baudelaire, the dark, sober style was a question of less is more. Any old nouveau riche grocer could appreciate jewels and fancy clothes, but it took a more refined sensibility to pay more attention to the cut and detail of your clothing. Baudelaire also was one of the first to talk about the relationship between la mode and modernité. So fashion and modernity were closely linked, and he talked a lot about how he liked to look at fashion plates because each one was imprinted with the feeling of its time, so that the way a sleeve or a skirt was cut gave you important clues about ideals of beauty at that exact moment in time. So he was really sort of among the first philosophers of modern fashion. You can also see in this the importance of fashion imagery in helping to create the image of the Parisienne. Because if Paris had been seen for a long time as being the capital of fashion, increasingly over the 19th century, you see an equal or even greater emphasis on the figure of the Parisienne, who, because of her clothes and her demeanor, represented modern beauty. And it was not only that the great lady could be a Parisienne, but a courtesan could, a fashion professional, even a poor little grisette could. Anyone who aspired to become a Parisian could hope to do so. At the time, there were many people writing things like, provincials put on clothes, but the Parisienne dresses. The Parisienne is more of a woman than any other woman in the world. And then saying, but anyone could come to Paris and become a Parisienne if she were really dedicated to that. One of my favorite lines came from a woman writer in the 1860s who wrote, in Paris, half of the population lives off fashion, and the other half lives for fashion. Notice there's a chapter in the book about how these fashion plates influenced artists. And so you see here with Monet's Women in a Garden, how the silhouettes of the dresses are similar to the way the dresses are silhouetted in a fashion plate. And at this point, Monet didn't have enough money to be buying dresses for his models. He might have rented them or borrowed a dress, because you could rent a dress, just as Rent the Runway is not a new idea. And in fact, they're very similar looking women, but in different poses and in different dresses. And this, again, is similar to the way fashion photography works, that you're showing fashions from all different angles and putting them together into the same image. Here you see an example of a dress from the museum at FIT's collection, which is very similar to the kind of dresses that Monet was portraying. Now, the rise of the haute couture was a crucial moment in the history of French fashion. So by the second half of the 19th century, Paris became the capital of luxury fashion, of haute couture, which was not just a question of an individual dress made for an individual lady. That's any kind of couture, that's just sewing. There were hundreds of little couturiers sewing dresses for ladies. But with the rise of the haute couture, men like Charles Frederick Worth took fashion from being a small-scale craft and turned it into big business and high art. He didn't just make one dress for one lady. I mean, he might do that for the Empress Eugenie, but for most of his customers, he made a line of dresses, sketched them, and then you could order a particular model from this line in a particular color or fabric. You could modify it slightly, say change the sleeves on one, but basically it was a kind of industrialized production. It was mostly hand sewn, but it's already conceived of as a collection. At the same time that you have the rise of the haute couture, you also have a retail revolution, so the rise of the department store, and increasingly you have ready-made clothes available, suits for men, and clothes that didn't need to fit so closely for women. So things like shawls and mantles were often produced in factories and were sold ready-made or almost entirely ready-made, just needing a little touching up when you bought it at the department store. Here you see a cartoon mocking Worth, where you see he's sort of there and his assistant is doing the actual pinning. He's there, and he was famous for telling people what to wear and having to wait for inspiration to strike before he would come up with a design. Very, very interesting, much mocked character, but very formidable in transforming fashion in this way into something that was a new kind of business. He was very fond of American clients. He said they had the faces, the figures, and the francs. And a lot of them would, even very wealthy women, sometimes their husbands or fathers-in-law would complain because they got so many clothes from Worth, particularly if they were lucky enough to be visiting the one of the imperial palaces for a long weekend, which could involve as many as 20 different changes of dress. Again, another artist inspired by the world of fashion, Edgar Degas. The millinery was actually, the milliners even were before Worth in putting labels with their names on them into the hats. Worth, of course, did that also, as Worth felt he was a real artist, and so the label was the equivalent to the signature of the artist on a painting. It was his griffe, his scratch, that made it his and made it more valuable. So you have then Paris as this ideal shopping city with the department stores, the little boutiques, the Ock Couture salons. But fashion is not just about making and buying clothes. It's not just a big store. The geography of fashion and its significance socially went way beyond that, to the whole idea of a theater of fashion. Here you see Mary Cassatt's painting of a woman with a pearl necklace in a loge. Paris was in effect a stage on which the newest fashions were acted out by viewers at the theater as well as by the actual performers like Sarah Bernhardt. And some of the performances were attended assiduously by small-scale couturiers and milliners who wanted to see what the famous actresses were wearing by famous designers. And some designers had very close relationships with particular actresses. You also had a private world of soirees and balls where people of the same social class would gather and would understand, again, the nuances of fashion within that particular world. This is a painting by Jean Béraud, who did a number of such images, both of interiors and of the same kind of people going bicycling in the Bois de Boulogne or going to a chocolate shop or the theater. Some of you know that last year we had an exhibition here on Proust's Muse, and Paris Fashion has a whole chapter about Proust and fashion. Here you see the Countess Grefful wearing the marvelous dress that she co-designed with the House of Worth. And Proust learned a lot from the Countess Grefful and from her cousin, who was also a great connoisseur of fashion. This kind of sophistication of fashion culture and the fact that great writers and artists thought there was nothing inferior about looking down on fashion. Fashion was an important manifestation of society and of personality. So it's very different than America, where you had writers like Thoreau saying, "Beware of any occasion that requires new clothes." Instead, this is a culture which is just saturated in an interest in fashion, and men as well as women were very interested in it. The first of the sort of avant-garde fashion revolutions in the 20th century occurred with the rise of a sort of new silhouette, a somewhat neoclassical silhouette, particularly associated with Paul Poiret. Poiret claimed that he had abolished the corset and put women into brasiers instead, which is not true. But he did help promote and popularize this particular new silhouette. What you really are seeing, though, if you look at these figures here and then compare it with photographs at the time, you're seeing the gradual development of a new ideal of beauty, from the voluptuous Venus of the later 19th century to the slim, youthful Diana of the early 20th century. And in 1903, Les Modes magazine interviewed a lot of actresses, including Réjeanne, asking about who's your favorite couturier, who's your favorite jeweler, who's your favorite corsetier, and Réjeanne said, "Pas besoin, I don't need a corset." And of course, you look at her photograph and you go, "Honey, you are wearing a corset." But the point was, it was now starting to be thought that it was better not to need a corset, to be naturally slim but curvy. Here you can see another illustration from 1913, where you can see the fashions from 1813 were very similar to those from 1913. You were looking back and having a new neoclassical era. The period between Poiret's harem and Dior's new look was one dominated by a regiment of women, of which the most important were Gabrielle Coco Chanel, shown here, and a little bit later, Elsa Schiaparelli. But there were literally dozens of famous women couturiers in this period, because the feeling was that who better than a woman designer would know how to dress the new woman of the 1920s and 30s. Male designers like Patou had to say to the press, you don't have to be a woman to design clothes. You know, men can design clothes too. In the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of interchange between New York and Hollywood and Paris. Here you see Josephine Baker in Paris wearing Parisian fashion with her car, but you also had Parisians and French people looking at Hollywood movies, listening to music from Harlem, and there was a constant back and forth of ideas. I remember reading one French fashion magazine which was instructing its French readers how you could Baker fixer your hair. You could make your hair look like Josephine Baker. During the Nazi occupation of Paris, obviously contact was cut off with most of the Allied countries. Germans could buy clothes, and wealthy or connected French people could buy clothes, and South Americans sometimes would be buying clothes in Paris. The Germans initially wanted to bring the whole Paris fashion industry to Berlin, but Lelong, who was head of the Couture Association, managed to convince him that it wouldn't function anywhere outside of Paris. So he managed to keep it there. However, it nearly destroyed the French fashion industry in terms of its influence, in part because people discovered in England and America that, in point of fact, between 39 and 45, they could get along without guidance from Paris, which they hadn't really attempted to do since the Napoleonic Wars, when fashion designs were smuggled out anyway. After the war, with the rise of Dior and the new look, suddenly Paris made an immense push to regain its prestige and its financial position as being the capital of fashion for women. As Dior said, we came out of a period of war, of women who looked like soldiers and boxers. I dreamed of women who looked like flowers. And very rapidly, within a few years, French couture was back on its feet, and designers in other countries were once more copying Paris fashion. But underneath, the strength of the couture system was gradually being hollowed out, so that although it appeared very, very strong during that golden age of the French couture from 47 to 57, in fact, things were happening elsewhere in the world that were making the couture increasingly old-fashioned. Specifically, you had the rise of youth culture in London and in America in particular, which undercut the whole interest in grown-up, formal, fitted, expensive clothes. Last year, we had a wonderful show about Paris fashion 57 to 68 by Colleen Hill, which talked about the rise of French ready-to-wear and of the Youthquake designers in Paris. People like Emmanuel Kahn, who's shown here, who said, haute couture is dead. And these younger designers, often women, were promoting the idea of youthful styles for a young market. The couture fought back, creating their own versions of mini dresses. André Courrèges, for example, said, I'm the man who invented the mini skirt. Mary Quant only popularized it. And Mary Quant said, well, that's not how I remember it. But anyway, it was the girls in the street who invented the miniskirt. It wasn't a fashion designer. And here you see Yves Saint Laurent. This is 1967 with a very radical trouser suit. And then, of course, a year later, it was May 1968, and Youthquake and sort of semi-revolutionary fashion came to Paris in a great burst. Meanwhile, in America, the ready-to-wear industry kept chugging along. And although much of it was indebted to copies of Paris styles, there were also radical new sportswear looks and new sort of much more casual-looking styles. In 1973, the famous battle at Versailles took place when 5 American designers were shown versus 5 French designers. And designs by Stephen Burrows and Halston seemed younger and fresher, or at least the models, many of them African American, made the clothes seem so much younger and fresher than the more formal and fitted Parisian couture. So you were having new things coming out of New York, new things coming out of London. You were also having new things from the 50s on coming out of Italy, all kinds of boutique fashions coming out of Florence, and then Florence fought with Rome, which had the alta moda, the couture, and then eventually by the 70s, Milan took over, and you had designers like Versace and Armani and Missoni who were showing clothes in Milan that were easygoing, kind of easy chic clothes. Pierre Berger once said to the American journalist Jay Cox, "What have the Italians ever invented except spaghetti?" And this was kind of, and Jay Cox wrote the article, and he said, well, how about a kind of easy elegance in clothes, like Armani, that seems to be very different from the stiff, formal French fashions. However, by the 80s, French fashion was booming again. Here you see Christian Lacroix, who in 87 was the first major couture house to open in years, from having had hundreds of couture houses in the 50s that had dropped in number, and essentially the couture became like a trailer for the film, which was really makeup and perfume. So it was kind of an expense, like an advertising expense. Nevertheless, fashion was really fashionable in the 1980s. If you're old enough, you might remember that, at all levels. And this is when the French started really having a fashion museum at the Louvre, and they started all kinds of more modern fashion schools, and they started showing fashion shows at the Louvre and really emphasizing fashion as a part of the patrimony of France. In the early 90s, things went into a bit of a downer, and the press, even in France, started saying that, was the couture dead? And the Americans were quite open, saying the couture is an absolutely defunct thing. And then suddenly in 97, you had John Galliano going to Christian Dior, and the couture suddenly became super exciting again. You also had other foreigners, such as Alexander McQueen, here also Givenchy, 1997. And this, in a way, shows how Paris has been able to co-opt the best talent from other fashion cities. In the 80s, you'd seen the rise of Tokyo as an exciting fashion city, but all the best designers like Rei Kawakubo ended up showing in Paris. So instead of Tokyo really challenging Paris, it just fed the best of its talent there. Nowadays, of course, you've got fashion cities all over the world: Milan, New York, London, Tokyo, now Shanghai, the Paris of the East, and even more, sort of from Moscow to Mumbai, everywhere you have fashion weeks and fashion shows. But it's still, Paris seems to be attracting some of the most avant-garde of the designers, like Iris van Herpen. So fashion is not just, of course, a material production of fashionable clothes. It's also a symbolic production, an idea, a series of images. It's something which is exciting and new. Didier Grumbach, who's been working in Paris fashion since the 1950s, wrote, he said in 2015, "Paris has changed. The system has changed. Everything has been transformed. For the system to function, the participants have to be international. Production has to be international. It's clear that we no longer can or should be 100% French anymore." So things have changed a lot. Fashion is a global phenomenon, and yet, if Paris is not the capital of fashion, it is still, I think, very much first among equals in the fashion cities of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. The first question is, what role do you think museums play in Paris fashion? I think a big role, partly because museums are telling the history of fashion, and the history of fashion is marked by a very strong presence of Paris. But also nowadays we're seeing a lot more with the big fashion houses are working with museums to create their own exhibitions. So you have the big Dior show now at the Museum of Decorative Arts, or their own museum like the Yves Saint Laurent Museum. So you have a kind of iconization of particular designers by the houses and by museums. I think museums have had an important role also in getting us to think about fashion as being an art form. And we tend to see fashion in real life when we go to our closet, when we go shopping, when we look at Instagram, when we see our friends. But when you see fashion in a museum, it's looking at it from a different perspective. And I think the French have always thought about fashion as being an art form. Back in the 18th century, Mercier said, fashion is a cherished, triumphant art form. And so I think museums have had a big role in reinforcing that idea. What fashion designer has inspired you the most? Well, I'm very much a fashion person. In other words, a neophyte. It's whatever I'm working on now at any given moment. I mean, in the past, of course, I've been very, very influenced by people like McQueen. I really wildly admired. I'm working now on a big exhibition for fall 2018 on the color pink. And quite apart from the fact that everybody's been doing millennial pink for the last 3 years, a few designers like Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons has been doing really interesting things with pink for quite a few years now. She's most famous for doing black, 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 7 shades of black. But already in the early 90s, she was doing radical, disruptive things with pink. And in her biker ballerina collection, for example, she was showing how the ballerina pink is not just this sweet, soft, pretty, girly thing, but the ballerinas are tough and athletic, just like bikers. And I've bought a couple of things for the museum from Ray's 18th century punk collection, which used a lot of pink. And I'm going to be showing one of those garments next to a really beautiful pink robe à la française from the 18th century that the museum just acquired. So at the moment, I'm sort of obsessed with people who are doing pink. Which also includes, interestingly, for a middle-aged, not to say older, white woman like me, it was really exciting to be able to discover all the pink in hip-hop. So I'm desperately trying to get a hold of Cameron to get the pink mink that he wore to New York Fashion Week in 2001, because that sort of helped turn all the hip-hop guys onto pink. What's my all-time fashion exhibition? Well, I do think the 2 versions of the Alexander McQueen show at the Met and at the V&A were quite fabulous. They were different rooms I preferred in different museums. For museums, for shows I've done here, I have a great love of my Gothic show, and I loved working on Daphne Guinness with our show. I also still remember years ago an amazing, really amazing Charles James show at Brooklyn, which I think has never really been outdone. That was the most amazing Charles James show ever. I remember asking one of the guards jokingly if he could just leave the room for a while so I could try and steal one of the dresses. Do I have any advice for a budding fashion curator? Yes. See if you can get advanced training, at least a master's degree, and try and get internships at museums. And build up your area of expertise so that you're capable of doing things on your own, because there's not very many curatorial jobs. When I had my epiphany to work on fashion, I had a million adjunct jobs for more than a decade, but in the meantime, I wrote, my first 10 books, and I started my fashion magazine, and I was doing stuff on my own. So don't wait to be hired. Try and do things yourself that are contributing to knowledge about fashion. You can always do an imaginary exhibition online. You can write reviews of other people's exhibitions. There are lots of ways that you can show that you are becoming an expert, a fashion historian, and you have potential for being a fashion curator. Thank you very much.